Hi, this is Scott Bradfield, and this is the latest episode of Reading Great Books in the Bathtub. And this is a bit of an off the cuff episode today. Most of them are pretty off the cuff. And I thought we'd talk about one of the great monuments of bathtub displacement, Archimedean. This is an Archimedean book we're talking about this week, which is the new recent Penguin translation of the complete 1001 Nights, sometimes known as the Arabian Nights. Here they actually use the Arabian Nights, Tales of 1001 Nights, which I've always wanted to read in my life. And many times, I started several times different translations, the Richard Burton, and I forget another translation I used to have, I tried to work through. And this was a real pleasant surprise to find out recently that this had all been done several years ago. I think it's 2010, that the 2008, that in three volumes they've translated the complete 1001 Nights. I can't recommend it enough. This is a wonderful translation, first of all. It reads really well. It's a very difficult book to translate. I'm going to give my very inexpert knowledge of the 1001 Nights in that there's never been a primary text. So what it sounds like is that for thousands of years, the 1001 Nights has been this ever-changing sack of stories that going back to pre-Arabic times. A lot of it seems to have been located in Syrian manuscripts. Excuse me, I'm reading this stuff really quickly and not paying too much attention because I'm spending all my time on the stories. Lots of the stories that we associate with 1001 Nights have, such as the Aladdin stories and Ali Baba and the Sinbad stories, aren't even in many of the so-called primary texts. But there's not one text that people can translate. So the history, every version of it is in wildly different states. It's also quite clear that the stories are very different. So, for example, the first third of this first volume are very traditional, what you would associate with the Arabian Nights, which is there's lots of genies and magic and love and people taking over empires and so forth. But then about a third of the way into the book, it turns into a large epic novel romance about this clash between Muslim cultures and Constantinople run by the Christians, and this big long battle and this family's battle against the Christians and the infidels and so forth. And it shifts tone and structure all the time. Now the basic premise of the 1001 Nights, which is most interesting and most confusing sometimes, is that it's what's called portmanteau story or framed narratives. The framed narrative for 1001 Nights, as you may know, is Shahrazad, the story of Shahrazad, and a woman who's supposed to be very bright and intelligent, and there's an evil king who decides he hates women. And the framing opening story is that he goes out and decides that he wants to sleep with a different virgin every night and then kill her because he just hates women. So he doesn't trust women and he wants to kill them after he's had them, and that's it. So Shahrazad and her sister Dunyazad, I'm pronouncing these wrong, I'm sure, is a very bright woman who asks her father to send me to this horrible king. And she has saved in her head all these stories and all these fantastic stories, all these entertaining stories. And what she does with this king is that every night they have sex, and then she tells him a story. And she ends every story, every night she stops the story before it's over and goes on and says, well, we're going to have to sleep together one more night so I can tell you the rest of the story. And the king is basically over 1001 nights, falls in love with her, and they get married, and he becomes a nice guy. So it's another one of these stories like Pamela, where you have the evil man seduced by this woman who and she's telling him stories and through her virtue and so forth. And I think she must be good in bed because they managed to do it 1,000 times, and she's still telling him stories. Now, there's a frame story here that covers the entire 1,001 Nights. The stories themselves are often frame stories. And that's one of the most fascinating and sometimes confusing aspects is, for example, you will have a number of people come together in our house. It's like Canterbury Tales, the Decameron, and the people come together in a house, and then they each challenge each other to tell stories, and each of them tells a story, and often the person telling the story is another frame narrative who tells a story about a bunch of people coming together and telling stories. So often they're just kind of fantastic, fun, glamorous, amazing, surprising stories. Later, when we get into this long epic, and again, I'm only halfway through the first volume, when we get into this large epic of the battle between the Christians and the Muslims, we have other stories, which are stories about being a good king. These stories are obviously written at a totally different time, but have been just thrown into this portmanteau and just jumbled together. And the shifts of narratives and how the stories are told are all encompassed by this one frame narrative of Shahrazad. I want to say again, that you can sit down and read this in the bathtub, and you can take it out of the bathtub, and you can pretty much immerse yourself in these fabulous stories. And the translation's excellent. You just don't notice it, as I did when I was reading some of the previous translations. It just flows so nicely, and I don't know about accuracy of the translation, but all I know is I'm really enjoying reading it, so much so that I bought all 3 volumes, and we'll probably just read them over the next few weeks. There's not a lot to talk about. I don't want to destroy these wonderful stories by discussing, metafiction or self-reflective narrative, or all the stuff that we might discuss as academics. But just really, really advise this is a book that you could read to yourself. I think you could pretty much, despite the sexual content, and there is quite a lot of sexual content in it, young people would enjoy the books, I think, too. Fairly mature young people would enjoy it. So I won't talk too much more about the 1,001 Nights. I will recommend everyone go get it. And I thought, for fun, as I was reading these books, I would try to deal with another writer, a fairly contemporary American writer, named John Barth. One of the challenges of our series has been to read writers who are challenging and who are difficult to read. Now, John Barth became quite significant in the 60s as one of the fabulist writers, fabulist and fable-like. And he was, Kurt Vonnegut was that period, Donald Bartholomew was of that period. People like John Hawkes. I was in a little kind of conversation with people recently about a writer named John Hawkes, who was part of the fabulist tradition, who I found impossible to read. To this day, I find impossible to read. And many of the so-called fabulous writers don't hold up. But Barth, as a writer, was always good. And his stories are not that complicated, particularly at the beginning. But I thought over the next few weeks, while we're discussing 1,001 Nights, or reading 1,001 Nights, I would discuss some of the really interesting John Barth novels, starting with his first 2 books, End of the Road and The Floating Opera, and move on to some of the very self-consciously Arabian Nights-like books, such as Chimera, one of the really sleeper books. It's a very complex book, but really fun. And all of Barth's books are really fun. And his story of Sindbad, he does know somebody, the last voyage of somebody, the sailor. Because for Barth, the 1,001 Nights and this sort of sea of story, which has no meaning to it except entertainment, and has no meaning to it except to pull you into a story and to close the door and to throw away the key. The key to the treasure is the treasure, John Barth says in many of his books. And I think it's a good time to kind of remember what a good writer. Barth is still alive, and not that productive, I think, at this point in his life, but he produced a lot of really interesting books. So over the next year or two, I thought we would pop in and out of John Barth's books. And I would also like to continue reading some of these kind of big doorstopper compendiums of great folk stories, such as 1001 Nights or the great Monkey series from China, or even Pu Song Ling, who was also another great compendium keeper of great stories. So that's this week. Very short. Go out and read this book. I won't tell you anything more except you're going to have a great time. You're going to really enjoy it, and I think you really kind of need to kind of give yourself a long period of time to read these in. I don't think you should put them away and pick them up again. I think this volume really should just be read through over the course of a few weeks, and we will go on and discuss a little bit about the great John Barth, and I think we'll start with the floating opera in the next couple of weeks. Okay, guys, take care. Go get this book. You're gonna really have a great read with these 1001 Nights. Okay, bye.